Thank you, Sendel. Welcome everyone to our Chicago event. Excited to have you all here. We have a great mix of people here, kind of industry leaders, kind of your peers. We've got a number of technology folks here. Some of the xMatters partner organization is here as well. So I encourage you in the breaks to get together, talk to each other. If you didn't already have a chance to meet over breakfast. Just by quick way of introduction, Abbas Haider Ali, I am CTO at xMatters. I've actually held many roles within the organization over time. I've been with xMatters for 8 years. My career spans more time than I'd care to admit. I've had to cut my hair shorter and shorter over time to hide the grays. It's an effective strategy up to a point until there'll be no hair left, which also, from a family genetics perspective, is only a matter of time anyway. So, in my roles, I've kind of worked at a number of different startups over time. I've held a variety of different technology roles. One of the aspects of my role at xMatters is I'm responsible for our product strategy, so direction we take in the marketplace, but I spend the majority of my time out in the world. So that means lots of different things. I think it's actually a ploy to just keep me out of the office so I don't harass people in there. But what I do get to do is spend a lot of time with a lot of companies all over the world, both kind of service providers, other technology companies, as well as a lot of larger enterprises, all of whom fit kind of a general profile. And the general profile is they are very large. So typically, I spend a lot of our time with companies that are in the billions of dollars of revenue. Kind of global 2000 sort of scale is very common. And they're all facing very similar sorts of challenges. And those challenges are driven, as Sendel mentioned, by changes in the marketplace. So you've probably all heard the Mark Andreessen phrase of software is eating the world, kind of a general conceptual thing that really started at this point, really driven by the first transitions into kind of cloud software, really started this trend in earnest. And it's something that we've seen really impact a lot of different markets and technologies. And one of the recurring themes we've seen on here is it used to be kind of software is eating the world, then it became like this thing of mobile is eating software, and then now you hear about AI eating mobile. And if there's certain conclusions to take from these changes of phrases, is that technology is clearly very hungry. And I think it's really just a lack of a proper breakfast, or I don't know what it is, but in general, we have this general phrase that these phases come faster and faster, and everyone is designed to disrupt the previous phase. And in fact, one of the things that's also another subtle but really important shift that we've started to see is that businesses have to be reimagined, not by using any of these technology waves as a feature, but as reimagining the market itself. So as an example, if you work in a large enterprise, if you work in insurance and finance and retail, healthcare, you may look at mobile initially and say, well, that means we should have a mobile app for our customers. We should make it easy for people to utilize our systems through mobile applications. And that was kind of the first wave of really looking at it. But what we started to see was a big change in the marketplace where people would say, wait, but should I reimagine my entire business to be mobile first? And that's where you saw transitions coming into place, disruptions that we hear about all the time now that are pretty common, things like Uber revolutionizing transport, Airbnb revolutionizing the hotel industry, and so on. So we see kind of these different phases come into play, and AI is probably one of the more exciting and probably one of the more dangerous trends that we've seen in terms of its ability to really throw things off. And the idea there is that it can upend entire industries. So things that you look at, whether it's transportation through autonomous driving, or you look at it from the perspective of legal, you can actually have legal AI translations. There's actually thought of, you hear a lot about blue-collar jobs being replaced by technology. Well, this actually isn't limited just to they're actually active startups who I've worked with who are working to actually build AI lawyers, right? And now we should really worry when there's a plus side to this. You have a lawyer-free world, which I think everyone agrees is something we want to have. But you wind up with cold software-based lawyers, which in some ways might be even worse. So Terminators were scary. Imagine an army of Terminator robots that are lawyers. I mean, that's literally the stuff of nightmares. But the sorts of things that you kind of have to kind of think about, right? And this applies in all sorts of industries. There's other technologies you hear about that start off, like blockchain was an interesting example of a cryptocurrency, something you kind of play with, right? Bitcoin, kind of a cool place to do stuff. And then you get blockchain, which reimagines an entire industry for dealing with ledgers in financial industries. There's a startup who I was talking to just a few weeks ago, and they're looking to actually to use blockchains to capture identity. Not identity in the sense of I have a single login to get into multiple sites, kind of how we look at it as single sign-on sort of technology, but imagining it as a way for people to take back control over their information. So today, we all kind of leave digital footprints and leave our data all over the place. We hand over the details of our lives to Facebook. Our search histories, as disturbing as they are, we give them to Google. And we can hand over searches and information to everybody, but that information is now the property of those companies, and they profit off those. We've built massive technology giants based on the data that we have provided. Right, so if you look at kind of the FANGs, so the FANG companies, so Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, kind of their entire company, their companies succeed, and their market capitalization is based on the data that we have provided to them. So this other company that I'm talking to is looking at turning that back around, saying as people, we should actually have our own blockchains of the information that we share, our search history, our preferences, where we buy stuff, and the companies have to come to us and be like, hey, can I access this information? And the blockchain allows it to be an auditable trail, so you can go through and say, well, I'm okay with you using it to recommend a product to me, but not to use it to advertise to me. And what you've done is killed an entire industry that's based on ad revenue. And those are the sorts of things that are right under the surface of things that we see. And the really exciting and terrifying part of this is that those transformations happen very, very quickly. And the example I like to use about this is autonomous vehicles. So, I've always I always liked cool new technology. It's always kind of fun to do. One of the things that we actually suffer a little bit from being in the Bay Area where I'm based is you kind of get trapped in a bubble where everything seems like it's going to happen tomorrow. Like we'll be in flying cars, jetpacks, and autonomous cars all the time. But in fact, this is one of those very real technology disruptions where if you go back just 5 years ago, it was not really a thing that you kind of was like experimental sort of thing, but it's not like GM, Ford, and there was no state licenses being issued for cars to be able to drive themselves. Cars weren't taking driving exams, but they actually can now. In fact, we have enough mileage in a lot of these autonomous systems where they statistically are safer than people driving, right? Which is kind of true if you think about it, right? I mean, I'm known for my own sort of distracted driving. I drive stick shift and have for a long time, but I'll eat a hamburger, be stick shift, I'll be on a phone call, fiddling with the radio, driving 100 miles an hour with all those things happening at the same time. And it actually is pretty safe to say that a robot is a safer driver than I am, which is why I use a lot of Uber now. It's actually just better for society in general. But those are sorts of kind of transformations that happen, but they have multi-order effects. So when you examine kind of something like that, you're like, oh, that's kind of okay. It's an interesting example. But what happens to the insurance industry as those technologies come into play, right? The entire insurance industry is based on insuring individual owners. If you take that away, all of a sudden you can imagine an insurance company saying, hey, we have millions of customers, but that's going to become 4, because there's going to be 4 autonomous driving companies, right? So that's our customer base. What do? That's a whole different relationship that you have to consider. What happens to the space that we dedicate to parking lots? What happens to people that paint lines on the road, right? We don't need lines on the road. Cars know where to drive on their own. What are the systems that happen as those multi-order sort of effects? And these accelerations are massively disruptive because they happen very quickly and unexpectedly. How many people would have predicted that Amazon was going to buy Whole Foods this week? That didn't really seem like a thing, right? I mean, I like Amazon, I like Whole Foods. I never thought, hey, these guys should be together. It's kind of a weird setup, right? And what's the next order effect of that? So I had an interesting discussion with someone, actually just yesterday. We were talking about like, what are the things that could have an impact on? How many of you buy things on Amazon? Just like a quick show of hands. Majority, right? How many of you ever returned something to Amazon? Also for a number of people. And what do we do when we do that? You grab a box that they send to you sometimes, you put your stuff in there, you take it to the UPS store, right? That's their primary return vehicle, or you have someone come pick it up. What if Amazon just said, in every Whole Foods, we're just going to have a small area where if you have a return, you just show up and drop your stuff off there. How much revenue do you think that costs UPS, right? Like you can imagine entire swaths of things simply being destroyed overnight because Amazon says, hey, you can drop things off at the Whole Foods store if you want to return your stuff. Right? It probably increases the ability to order stuff because I actually kind of sometimes think, I don't know if I want to order these things, so I may have to return one, so I'll skip it for now. But if it's just a matter of going off to the store to drop it off, maybe I'll order more, right? And how much they paid, $13-14 billion for Whole Foods? They made that up in their market cap increase just from the announcement, but the value they get from that would turn that entire thing around. And you can imagine all these sorts of things are happening all the time at higher pace, and it's a much lower cost for new entrants to kind of come into our marketplace. The pressure that puts on enterprises is that you literally are in a fight for your life on a regular basis from things that you don't even know. So you're fighting unseen enemies, and the pressure on technology organizations is to actually reimagine themselves. And what that means is that you're forced to go through and build technology at a faster pace and you have to actually deal with it in a much more constant organization. And this comes in, and it's reflected in lots of different mechanisms. So we see this on the development side. There was this big push many years ago now where people would say, we used to build in waterfall style, we're going to go agile, right? That was one of the first initiations of this, is the building technology part of our businesses went through this transformation into being agile. How many of you still have a part of your business that if you have technology development, that you still follow a waterfall style to building applications? Okay, I see a handful of things. And usually the places those come into play, and I'm not going to pull people to kind of say which applications they are, but they tend to be kind of core, very centralized, large functions within applications. Typically things that run on like mainframes or AX devices, Tandy environments, like those sorts of environments, the ones that tend to operate in those models, because they take a long time to release, they're very specialized skills, and they infect everything, right? So they're kind of connected to so many things, you kind of take a very slow, methodical approach to them. So for those applications, in some cases, maybe it is appropriate. But there's someone out there who's saying, you know what, even that part of it, I don't consider that to be sacred. I'm going to go through and modify that 100 times a day because that's what I'm allowed to do. And this is a pattern that we see repeatedly. So it started with the development side, but it's moving into other parts of the business as well. Other parts that historically have not moved in that same manner. So service management is a good example of that. Service management has kind of been going down this ITIL path for a long time. But now I hear a lot about organizations saying, well, we're kind of moving towards a lean ITIL model or an agile ITSM. And also to different phrases that service management is transforming to become faster. And we see it on the operations side. So operations teams actually tend, I'm referring to infrastructure and application operations organizations, those have kind of gone through multiple iterations that tend to happen more and more quickly. You may have heard phrases like no ops, AI ops, ML ops, VR ops. Actually, I did talk to someone who was doing VR ops, which I thought was really entertaining. It's kind of like you're playing you're in VR world, kind of managing your infrastructure. It's kind of a cool example. But kind of the general umbrella that these have been falling under are transformations that are classified as DevOps. Right, so we're trying to go through an examples saying these teams also have to have elements of agility that comes from the development side and operate at a higher pace. Now, where this actually comes in when we evaluate the market, so if you go out and actually, I spend a lot of time talking to clients and I go through and say, well, you've chosen to go this agility path to increase your ability to innovate and deploy technology and operate technology at a faster pace. How is that reflected in your DevOps project? Because that's kind of a label you can kind of go through and say, how are you doing in that model? I have a fair number of discussions, actually a disturbing number, that go through it and have a philosophical discussion around, well, what is DevOps? And in fact, there's plenty of articles that are still written on what is DevOps. And it's actually kind of one of those things that is a little frustrating because DevOps isn't that new anymore. In fact, there's been elements of DevOps around for almost 10 years. So we've been doing this for a fair bit of time, so we should be well beyond the definition phase. And I think the problem with DevOps and the reason it gets stuck in this definition framework is that cultural and organizational change is such a big part of it that people have a really hard time saying, what should I do next? It's very easy if I took a piece of software and I said, you want yourself some DevOps? Go ahead and buy this thing. It would be way easier. No one would be asking the what is DevOps question. But because it's cultural in nature as a starting point, and that's really one of the key elements of it, that is really where people tend to get stuck and go through and ask the question repeatedly. Well, what does it mean to me? And part of this is going through and saying, well, the biggest cultural change is the idea of having autonomy, the freedom to choose, and the ability to experiment. In fact, experimentation is one of the key things that we talk about when we're talking about DevOps cultural change and really impacting across the whole thing is how do you actually encourage people to experiment? And with experimentation comes the acceptance of failure. So my career started at IBM, and I can tell you from when I started there that failure was not a great trait. In my review process, when we had our annual review, it did not say, hey, how many failures have you had? And by the way, great job on those failures. That was not in my review process. My manager didn't sit me down and said, you know, what you're missing from this past year? Not enough failures. Maybe you can try to do things more wrong next year. That really would be great. It's not really part of a classical, large enterprise management training sort of thing, but it's actually a key part of cultural change within an organization. You have to be willing to experiment and you have to be okay with failure because the marketplace will experiment around you and will fail frequently enough and eventually will get you, right? It's basically this approach of you have to be okay with that experimentation. And that means that you have to be able to move at a higher pace, but your experiments can't be big experiments. So I would guess it doesn't matter how culturally okay everyone is with failures. If you work a large enterprise and you're like, hey, guess what happened? I experimented with something and I lost all of our customer data, or it all leaked online. That's a bad experiment, right? Like, that's one where you would get an F, and you deserve that F, and you actually probably should show up on the news and have to explain why your experiment was so terrible. But on a smaller basis, it actually is important to experiment with operational practice as well. And we see this show up in operational and support teams very frequently, is you have this idea of, if I don't have complete knowledge and complete control, this is not something that I'm willing to do. And that's reflected in very strict change management sorts of processes, and some of them are required, certainly for compliance and regulatory purposes, but we have to learn from other disciplines to be able to get better at it. So as an example, within the test and verification world on the engineering side, to move at higher pace, to do many more releases, you'll hear about web scale startups doing things hundreds of times a day out to production. The reason they're able to do it is they've actually built out a very mature operational test and verification process. And that involves doing things like canary changes. Then this applies to infrastructure. If you're making infrastructure changes, you should have in your model the ability to make small-scale infrastructure changes, evaluate them to make sure they're working before continuing to roll them out. So change, the classical change model of we have a change window and I have made changes in this window and everything is good so people can go back to bed, that is a terrible way to run things moving forward. What you should do is we should be learning lessons from the release side of the agile world. And that involves doing things like canary releases, and we want to use the same instrumentation across the board so we can actually see things all the way from dev out to production, and I'll talk about that later as well. And this is kind of a key thing is when you see models that have these restrictions around them, they're very strict, very rigid, where you assume that if I spend enough time on it now, the future is predictable. If those are the sorts of processes that you see in place, those are signals and hallmarks of the fact that you are actually at a low DevOps maturity level. There's nothing wrong with it inherently, but seeing the problem is the first thing, is really, well, admitting there's a problem, I guess, is the first step, if you want to look at it that way. At least that's what everyone tells me, is I should admit there's a problem. So within when we actually talk about these sorts of things, there's some clear symptoms that you can look for that indicate these sorts of challenges taking place. So there's plenty of surveys that go out about these sorts of things. How many of you read things like Atlassian's DevOps survey or the Puppet State of DevOps survey? Just a quick show of hands, maybe we can consume those. So there's a fair number of these that go out. I encourage you to read them because it's a great way to aggregate information, be able to see the problems that are out there. So you can go through and say, am I alone in this sort of issue, right? Who else is having this sort of concern? And where do people fall and how do they get to different levels of maturity? It's one of the outcomes I hope that you'll have from today is by talking to your peers, you'll be able to kind of get a sense of who's ahead of you in some areas, behind in others, and you'll help each other as a group kind of mature as well. So we did a survey with Atlassian, that we were actually part of that group that went out and did that. And there were a couple of key things that we came away from it. One of those sorts of indicators of maturity and kind of a barrier really to agility overall was that we saw these constraints in organizations where half of the organizations we talked to, and there were over 1,000 organizations we did talk to, under those conditions, half of them had very tight controls about who could declare customer impacting issues. And this kind of comes from a typical hierarchical structure that you see in larger enterprises, where even when an issue is detected and known to be causing customer problems, you have to go through the early stages of an incident management full mature process before you get to someone who's able to say, yes, let us post this on our customer support portal or something that says there is an issue that's going on. So from your mean time to detect, or from your time to detect to your time to alert your customers can be a large window. And the classical example I give on this, and I apologize if someone's here from the industry, I always use cable companies are a classical example of this. If you ever called your ISP and you're having a problem and you get the message that says, yes, we're aware of an issue in your neighborhood. It's the most annoying thing. You're like, you literally have a million ways of reaching me, and I have to wait on hold for 30 minutes to hear, yeah, we've got an issue, and we've known about it, but we just didn't tell you about it yet. It's the craziest thing. This kind of like proactive communication thing is very important, and part of it stems from the fact there's not enough automation between the people who see the problem to when they can communicate it to customers. You need to have some controls around it, but generally, if that's a very slow, methodical process, you have a problem in terms of maturity. The other thing that we actually run into is the fact that when we actually go out and observe people is how do you actually know that an issue is about to occur? And this goes back to what you choose to monitor. And this is a whole other long discussion that we'll have I think David actually is going to cover some of these sorts of things as well in his presentation later. But I encourage you guys to talk about this. Is one interesting challenge is how do you actually know something's going wrong? A lot of people that we talk to hear about outages from their customers. So someone calls you and says, hey, something is broken. You're like, no, it should be fine. And you check it out. You're like, actually, no, you're right. It is broken. Let me figure it out. It's a terrible customer experience, but it actually is a pretty common way that people go out and actually deal with these sorts of things. And it's because we monitor the wrong things, or we monitor for things that indicate something is broken, but we don't look for the early warning indicators. And one of the concerns there is if we use the same instrumentation in development and testing, we can actually capture things that are early indicators or anomalies, and we should push them into production support so they're looking for the same thing. We'll talk a little bit about kind of incident management a little bit later, but one of the things that's kind of an indicator of this is when you don't watch for anomalies that are early indicators of things that will become incidents. And part of this is a terminology thing. One of the areas that's kind of interesting is when you have these sorts of scenarios, how do you actually wind up working together across these various systems? So when you're talking about large enterprises, the idea that you have web scale sorts of teams to actually work together, you have hundreds of teams that are able to work together because it's part of their culture. The application definitions are such that they're able to talk to each other. They know who's responsible for what. But you wind up with these crazy ways of working together on issues. And the example I give of this is conference calls. So I've kind of worked with a lot of large enterprises, and one of those things is how they actually deal with the really bad outages, major incidents being one. How many of you have been on a conference call that had more than 10 people on it for an outage? Right? How many of you have been on a conference call that has more than 20 people? Right? So I've been on calls that have hundreds of people on conference calls, and it is a complete train wreck. And here's how the process typically works, right? You go through and say, look, when we have a major outage, we want to make sure we resolve it really quickly. No one's going to disagree with that, right? That seems like common sense. Big problem, solve it quickly. Pretty rational. What winds up happening in a lot of organizations is over time, they've learned that the problem could be in any number of places. So they've said, well, last time there was a security thing, so let's make sure next time the security person is already on the call. Then they go through and say, but sometimes it's the authentication thing, so we should get them on the call. We had that outage with that HP storage array, so let's make sure the vendor also is involved, and they jump on the call too. But last time, the first guy didn't know what he was doing, so his manager really knew who to contact, so let's make sure he's in the system too. And our VPs are always saying, hey, no one told me anything was going on. I had to hear about it from someone else, so let's bring them into the loop. And you have like this amazing network game. It's like the world's worst party, right? It's not where you kind of invite all your friends. Everyone is kind of in on this party, and you hop on this call. And you guys probably seen like the videos that make fun of them on like YouTube on stuff like this. We have a call with a few hundred people. People are joining randomly as they come into play, and then there's a constant beep. People coming and going, and they're like, and someone always stops in and says, "Hey, it's Abbas. Can you tell me what's going on?" And literally 5 minutes ago, someone else joined and asked the same question. So you're doing like the continual updates the entire time. The incident manager is basically like the chaperone for the world's worst party, right? Because they can't figure out what to do. And it really is a party. People are sleepy, people are drunk, someone's stuck in the bathroom, someone's about to get on an airplane, someone's dog is barking. It's ridiculous. And you're sitting there, and instead of solving the problem, you're trying to manage what is effectively guaranteed to be the world's worst collaboration session because you're on a conference call with 100 people. In fact, any more than 10 means you're going to have a bad time. That's just kind of how it is. So we have to find a better way to be able to work together. And fundamentally, the approach I've seen a lot of enterprises take is to go through and say, well, let's rewind this all the way back. We actually want to get better at alerting just the people who we think can help out. And we'll talk about how we kind of help target this thing down. But you're better off starting with a very small group and layering in people as you need them. And the overall resolution time is actually better, even though you didn't start off with everybody on the phone. Because starting off with everybody on the phone instantly means it's going to be terrible. And you wind up with all these kind of weird behaviors. I describe these as one of the things that very commonly happens is people always turn their phones down. So there's a lot of people on the call who actually aren't listening. And when you need them, you're like texting them, sending them messages on the side. Like someone's walking around the booth and saying, hey, they're calling your name. Are you going to pay attention? Right? You have all these weird sort of behaviors, and it's entirely ineffective. So one of the things I always like to talk about is you want to use the systems that you have in place to actually help you decide who to collaborate with. And this is kind of an interesting change that I've started to see in a lot of large enterprises, is breaking down the barriers between tools that people use allows them to actually interact better with each other. So as an example, if you actually go back and look at the release pipeline for any given application, you know who built the code, who tested it, who pushed it out, which systems it got pushed out to. You have this information in systems, and it should be utilized to go through and target the people you're going to engage. Because actually, a lot of outages and problems are caused by changes. How many of you have kind of had this experience, right, where something goes wrong and you're like, oh, it was a change that we made, right? It's kind of a weird, no one's ever heard of this, right? Like every change that we make is perfect because we spent 3 months planning it out. So it went exactly to plan and the outcome was totally predictable, right? Of course not, right? We tend to break things ourselves. Change is what causes the majority of issues that take place. And one of the things that we found is when we ask people, where is information going to come from that we're actually going to use to drive our collaboration, they can identify lots of systems. One of the most common things that people say is that when it comes to knowing who's responsible for what system, they rely on their CMDB. How many of you have a CMDB how many of you have a CMDB? Let's start there. How many of you, so keep your hand raised if your CMDB is reliable, where you're like, man, I trust that thing. Fewer hands, right? How many of you have seen multiple CMDB projects come and go? A number, right? So the previous startup I used to work at, we actually used to do a lot of CMDB projects, and it was super common to have clients go through and say, I'm on my 3rd round or 4th round of CMDB, and eventually it becomes this thing that's like a unicorn. You're like, I know of someone who has a CMDB. It's amazing. You know, it's got this beautiful horn. There's a rainbow that comes out of its rear end. It's fantastic. It solves all the world's problems. I would also like a unicorn. And you know what? These things just don't exist, and largely it's because the systems that we use to drive the data into them really come from the operational side. And one of the fundamental changes that we see is as you move towards better application design, it becomes really, really important for the engineering teams to publish into the world. And one of the interesting things that we've seen is as you switch to a model of if you build software, you're also running it, is that those problems naturally get solved. Because developers have one amazing trait, which is they are super smart and super lazy. And that works to everyone's benefit. I do that, right? It's basically, if I can automate it, I'm going to automate it. I like to automate as much as I can in my life. I don't want to do anything, right? As basically, I'm aiming for the Wall-E type world where I have like a floating chair and something that brings me drinks. That's kind of what I want to have. I'm waiting for like ultimate automation. So you want to have these systems that are able to go through and discover and learn about application architectures themselves. And that goes into application directories. Service mapping is something that's becoming more of an application contract and microservice contract versus being something that you have to go through and discover from the network. Like if you use a network discovery tool, those things are theoretically great, but practically terrible in terms of producing a reliable CMDB. So that's really another part of things that would come into play as well. And when we talk about the ability to actually go out and actually practically solve these sorts of things, there's a couple of key things I always recommend. Autonomy is really, really important. Not just for developers on the application side, but people who actually help you develop your infrastructure, application, production support sorts of processes as well. It's really, really important to have these frameworks in place so teams are able to self-publish information about their applications. They can go through and pull information from other teams as they need to. You actually want to be able to go through and say, hey, if you're in production support and there's an application issue, you have full access to the Jira backlog, both to pull information from and publish information to other backlogs if you need someone's help. If you're using Chef to push out configuration changes, you have the ability to do that. If your operational tool that you're using to gather insights is MoogSoft and someone wants to provide information back into it to say, hey, the last alert you sent to me was no good or was very helpful for the supervised learning part of it, that's information that everyone should be able to publish in and out of. If you're utilizing your service management system and your engineering team can't create tasks in ServiceNow or Sherwell for you, then you've got a problem. You don't have the sort of autonomy and information flow across it. The other thing that's really important and kind of is, again, borrowing from the developer ethos is this idea of having workflows across tools and actions that move across them. So if I know in my resolution process, when I get an alert, if I have all the insight delivered to me from all the other systems, kind of my modern CMDB, if you will, that tells me what's taking place and who's responsible, I want to have actions that actually people can go ahead and take that I would normally use. If I want to go through and say my typical actions in my workflow are rolling back a change or asking for a report from a canary release or creating a ticket, all those things should be part of my workflow. They shouldn't require context change. And that's part of this automation workflow is going through and build these components right into your process. And of course, at enterprise scale, it's really important to have accountability across these sorts of systems as well. So it's not just enough to go through and say, hey, everyone can do whatever they want, because again, as larger enterprises, you have compliance requirements, you're dealing with a much larger scale in terms of team, and you have to visibility across different teams as well. So we're seeing the structure of what used to be the NOC or the command center changing to actually take on a different function. And it's something that I spent a decent amount of time talking about. What is the future command center look like if every team is responsible for running what they build? And there actually is a key role for those teams to play as well. So one other thing I also want to talk about is, as we're going through and talking about workflow, it's how do we actually prevent incidents? And one of the tricks that I've kind of found that's pretty effective here is the use of the term incident. So how many of you, in some way, shape, or form, have ITIL present in your organization? Okay, a fair number of people. So I think this is actually one of the more interesting things that's kind of snuck in from the UK side is the ITIL terminology. So the word incident, if you actually are an ITIL Foundation person, you have a very strict definition of the word incident. And I actually think that's a terrible, terrible thing that's happened, is we've kind of taken a word, we've had a very strict definition of it, and a particular group of people have taken ownership of it. It was great when we were operating at slower pace, but now I think it's a problem. So people have taken the word incident and said, that's my word. Don't use my word. I'm on the service management team. I'm in the ITSM team. I'm the incident manager person. I own that. But the reality is an incident is a task that needs action because something's gone wrong. And that exists throughout the life cycle of an application. If I'm building software and my build fails, that's an incident for me. Right? It may not be an incident for you, but it is for me. If something happens in my release cycle or my test cycle, or when I'm actually pushing out an infrastructure change, even if there is no customer impact, it's an incident for me. I think that's sort of an important shift to kind of keep in mind, because when you actually do get to other approaches of dealing proactively with things that become incidents as customer impacting, as the definitions exist today, you want to be able to go through and say, no, anytime we need to act on something that could become an issue is in fact something that we should consider an incident, and the process that we use to handle that is the same across the board. We work together, we use the same tools for insight, we use the same tools for monitoring, the same tool for analytics, all the components that we use, all the process that we use are effectively the same. Now they have different levels of importance. I'm not going to wake someone up at 2 in the morning if the build reevaluation can wait till the next morning, but the process we set up in place, the tools we use should be the same, so that when things do go wrong, we're utilizing the same set of data and the same set of information to drive us to faster resolution. And that is a strategy that I've seen be very effective. And you'll hear more about that from various people during the course of the day. So as is typical, I tend to go over, and I've gone over once again. So I won't spend too much time. I hope you guys found that interesting. I'm going to be around all day if you want to talk about this stuff. Later, you'll have similar discussions with your peers. So next up, much more interesting and much more practical, I think you'll hear from David at Pacific Life.